All right, great. We're going to get started. So, thanks again for the interest here. As you all will have seen, this discussion is going to be focused on source reduction and the upcoming deadlines regarding the California requirement for individual source reduction plans. I'm sure all of you are still catching up on your sleep from having submitted your required data submissions to California, Oregon, Colorado, and others from May 31st. For those who haven't, we're happy to have follow-up discussions with you on that. Even for those who have, who want to double check your work, we're happy to have that conversation. But today's discussion, again, is very much focused on the required source reduction, individual source reduction plan submissions for California due August 1st. So we're going to go through some content as we have done in the past for those who have joined us. We do want you to post your questions throughout the discussion. We will have a Q&A at the end of the conversation after Russell does present some significant material to provide context. We want this to be as interactive and to address as many of your questions as possible. So, oh, good. Someone couldn't hear and now has fixed it. That's great. So without further ado, why don't we get started? Just quickly, some introductions. Well, let me start with the agenda. Sorry. Go back. So we'll do quick introductions on us. Russell will take the lead on both providing some broader context on the basics of source reduction. What is it? Why is it there? What are the requirements according to CAA and Cal Recycle? How do you think about the various factors to be considered in developing a source reduction strategy and plan, and some of the tools that we have available and that we think you would want to take advantage of for yourselves, either independently or with our help. And some thoughts around, really pragmatically, how can you start to take action already to address the source reduction requirements? And then again, we'll get into Q&A, but again, feel free to post those questions throughout the discussion. Okay? Great. So, quick introductions on our side. I'm Sebastian DeGrande. I'm the CEO here at PCX. I'm based in San Francisco. We are a global organization, but Russell and I are both based here in the US. Russell is our head of products and services. He'll be doing most of the talking and getting into the details here in the discussion today. Quick introduction on PCX for those of you who don't know us. Some of you are very familiar with us, but for those who don't know us, we are a plastic responsibility platform. Our mission is to ensure no plastic waste enters nature. We have three pillars to our offering. I'll start at the bottom right, which is our legacy offering of a plastic recovery marketplace. We work with 50 projects in 16 countries. We are by far the global leader in the recovery of plastic waste and the responsible processing with a fully transparent marketplace and registry for that activity. We've recovered over 500 million pounds of plastic globally. We work with a number of companies and brands on doing that and our project partners globally. Related to that is our second pillar, which is our circular plastics. So for those who are seeking to gain access to certified PCR through our project partners around the world, we have access to bales and pellets and flakes. We can help you with that effort as well. What we're going to be talking about today is very much about this third pillar at the top, which is our responsibility intelligence platform and services, which is both advisory services and expertise, which will be very much related to our discussion, but also enabled by our software solution, where we help not just with data ingestion and cleanup and reporting, but it provides management decision-making capability and insight on fees and how to modify those fees and be able to build scenarios, which really is what we're going to talk about today in terms of the source reduction plan submissions. So let's go to the next slide. Where I will use this to hand off to Russell, but it starts with what is source reduction and what does this term mean? And it's really related to the idea of minimizing the usage of plastic essentially at the source, right? And so at the end of the day, this is the first jurisdiction, California, that is explicitly requiring source reduction. And Russell will get into the details of this, but this is why it's become so front and center. while companies have been working on this independently and setting their own goals and targets, the fact that California now, as a regulatory jurisdiction and through a law, is requiring it is really kind of bringing a tremendous amount of focus to this topic. So, with that, let me hand off to Russell. And again, I encourage you to post questions along the way, and we'll go from there.
Amazing. Thank you for the kind introduction, Sebastian. And let's start talking source production. So just a quick look ahead, like what's happening now. All of you hopefully have submitted your weight reporting, component reporting to CAA. But August 1st, the source reduction plans are due to CAA. What's due? Your plan is delivered via a template, which we'll look at here in a minute, committing to CAA how you're going to hit source production targets. It may or may not become a binding agreement with CAA. That's a point of question we're going to dig deeper into. And every producer has to do one. Even the smaller ones, everybody's responsible for submitting something. And a quick reminder, source reduction only covers plastic. You've reported, you're tracking, you have multiple materials, but only plastic is covered under the source reduction requirements under the SB 54 law in California. And of course, PCX can help if you need help, both with your current footprint data and identifying opportunities and finding where reduction is possible. We're working on this with a couple of companies. So lots of experience here already. What is source reduction in California? It affects all the producers of single-use plastic. It was passed way back in 2022. So in theory, everybody could have known about this for a long time, but it's really just coming into implementation. Most people are starting to learn about the requirements now in this year, maybe even in this quarter or this month. Hopefully not this meeting, but we'll explain it. It applies to all the packaging sold in California, and California is seeking to cut the waste, boost recycling, and shift the financial responsibility of plastic away from consumers, away from the tax base, away from jurisdictions, towns and cities, municipalities, and onto the producers of that material. And as part of that, they're requiring reductions. So the impacts on the producers are reducing plastic weight by 25%. At least 10% of that is 10 of the 25 percentage points is supposed to come from reuse, refill, or elimination. And up to 8 percentage points of the 25 percentage points can come from PCR. We'll talk about how CAA is individual targets for this. Producers must also reduce plastic components by 25%. So in addition to the weight, the number of pieces that you're putting out into the market. And in CAA as a whole, all these numbers are collective, must ensure that 65% of plastic gets recycled, not just is recyclable, but is recycled. And 100% of packaging must be recyclable or eligible to be labeled as compostable. The big focus today is achieving the 25% source reduction, and so we're going to talk more about that. This is a visualization of the baseline and how it works. Everyone was required to submit I think CAA called it 2025 reporting year, but it was really for your 2023 footprint. And that baseline is set in stone. There is no changing that baseline moving forward. If your business grows, if your business shrinks, if things change, like you still have the same baseline and the same target. And it requires a 25% absolute source reduction. CAA has been back and forth with CalRecycle on this. CalRecycle is super clear. It is an absolute reduction. Even if your business is growing and you're reducing as a percentage of your business, that doesn't count. It has to be an absolute reduction. For some companies, if you're not growing, that's a 25% reduction. But if you are growing 4 or 5% per year, kind of regular economy growth, that's going to put your effective source reduction target by 2032, so within your 2031 reduction year, or so the 2031, the year you're putting the packaging into the market for 2032 reporting, is a 40 to 50% actual reduction. So the requirements are super steep if your company is growing at all. And again, your baseline is fixed. There's some interim targets along the way, but really the biggest one is getting to 25%. Um, the individual source reduction plan is due August 1st. Hopefully, you have submitted all of these other plans or reports that CAA requires. Hopefully, for California, if you are a producer with requirements in the other states, those will also do as well. And then, not the topic for this webinar, but Maine is still a bit of a question if CAA is going to be the producer and what's going to be, or sorry, the PRO, and what's going to be due this year. But really, the big one we're talking about today is this August 1st deadline of individual source reduction plan. Um, Actually, I'm going to go back one. One of the things I want to talk about is also the annual source reduction report. This was also due in May, and every year you will issue one of these reports to CAA. In this report, you will they will auto calculate the amount of plastic you reduced or grew from versus your baseline. But you also have to report how much you've reduced per pathway so that CAA can aggregate these numbers and report them to Cal Recycle to help track the implementation of the plan. They want to know if, for example, everybody's doing reduction via lightweighting, or the only thing that people are looking at is PCR, or maybe surprisingly or unsurprisingly, reuse and refill is having a larger impact than the other categories. So that's the type of information CAA's seeking to gather in that report. So what's in the source reduction plan, individual source reduction plan? Every producer does one. There is a workbook to help you do this in the CAA producer portal, and you will submit the contents of this workbook in the portal. The workbook's optional, but it's an easy way to start looking at this offline before you go to actually type in the numbers when you're all done. So in this report, you have to tell CAA a bunch of things. The first one is they want to know how much you reduced between 2012 and 2022. In the law, CAA is required to give prior reduction credit, or I don't think it's even credit. I think it's called recognition in the law. And in the guidance document that's provided along with this in the producer portal, CAA talks a little bit about that recognition. It essentially amounts to you can pay fewer fees now if you're using less plastic than you would have been using. There's not really a credit towards having to reduce any less in the future. So you've already done all your reductions in those prior few years. Congratulations, you're doing a great thing, but you still have to reduce. They also want to know how much APR certified PCR you used in 2023. The only PCR that counts for the program is APR certified PCR. So if you're currently in PCR, but it's not APR certified, you wouldn't get credit for all that in 2023, but it becomes an opportunity for you to get that PCR certified, and it can be a bonus for you individually moving into future years. They also want to know your projected plastic weight and components in 26, 29, and 31. This is a tough thing to answer, but they're asking everyone to put it in anyway. This would factor in your total supply for whatever reason you might have that supply. So is your business growing? Are you adding new types of packages? Are you actually reducing your packaging weight? And that's netting out against your growth in some way. They want that estimated number for weight and components for each of those years. Those years are aligned to the interim targets that are in the law. They also want to know your projected APR certified PCR in those years. So how much are you going to use? Is it certified? And then your projected reductions by pathway per year. So if you tell CAA in 2029 you're going to reduce by 10,000 pounds, they want to know how much of that is coming from reuse and refill, bring your own container, elimination, switching to non-plastic materials, and right sizing, lightweighting. If you'll have to be able to fill that in, estimate it in some way if you don't fully know it. And then CAA also wants text descriptions of your efforts to reduce. So they want you to tell them if are we just going to stop using packaging? Are we going to switch from this type of packaging, that type of packaging? Like what types of things are you doing? They want to know that information about your company. There are some risks and clarifications that need to be made by CAA that we'll highlight here. The first one is that your source reduction plan is probably not going to be confidential. There is a way when you submit it where you can say that these parts of the plan are confidential information. We do not want this to be released. However, CAA is required by law to disaggregate all of these individual plans and submit them all individually to CalRecycle. As a government entity, CalRecycle is subject to FOIA requests, and CalRecycle can determine if your whatever information you put in this plan, if it's a trade secret that can't be shared, or if maybe they would not redact that information. There's not really a playbook or a precedent for secrecy here. So it is honestly a gray area whether or not the public generally is going to find out about what you've submitted to the CAA. Secondly, the individual source reduction plans may or may not be legally binding. In the guidance, CAA has stated in unclear terms of whether producers will need to have a secondary agreement in which they would agree to hit these numbers that they sent to CAA, or perhaps they're already under a binding agreement through the general agreement that everyone has signed to use CAA as the PRO, but of course that agreement does not have specific source reduction numbers in it. So that needs to be clarified. And what happens if a producer says they're going to reduce by 10%, but then they only reduce by 8% for whatever reason, maybe their business grew more than projected. It is unclear what will be the implication or impact of your projections not being accurate to what you actually report in those years. It is a tough task, but it is something that CAA is hoping that companies can handle. Finally, very interestingly, CAA's source reduction incentive plan doesn't put any individual targets on any individual producers. We've added a diagram here to kind of explain this dichotomy and how it works. So as the PRO, CAA needs to create source reduction incentives to reduce weight, reduce components, hit the targets, and then create a program plan of how this is all going to be administered. They would submit that plan to the regulator, which would then approve CAA's plan. The plan is not approved, it is not final, especially the source reduction part of it. And there's a chance that if the population of producers who are submitting source reduction plans, if these aren't adding up to 25% under the incentive mechanism, which CAA is hoping will incentivize producers, CalRecycle could come back and reject it and require other measures to be taken, such as imposing 25% targets on individual companies. It is a gray area. We don't know exactly which way that's going to go, and it's probably going to depend on what comes back in these individual source reduction plans. And the producers, what is their responsibility here? They have to submit individual source reduction plans and provide all this data. They have to estimate their source reduction ability, which is embedded in those numbers, and tell CAA what they think they can do, given the framework of financial incentives that CAA has laid out in the incentive plan. If you haven't read the incentive plan yet, it's in the producer portal, and you should go review that to understand how it works. Then, of course, producers need to do the reduction work year over year, start to make changes. The source reduction incentive plan, super important for source reduction. This gives reasons for producers to try to hit the 25% targets that are outlined in the law. Again, you can view this document in the producer portal. None of the specifics are being shared here, but some of the generalities. You can reduce, under the plan, you can reduce your EPR fees with financial incentives. There are bonuses that are provided for reducing under your 2023 baseline, or a smaller bonus for reducing under your 2026 targets, or your weights and components. You can get slight bonuses for that. There's bonuses for using PCR in select categories, and PCR is more and less rewarded under various categories, and you can see like how that looks in the plan, how much bonus you might get per pound. You think about that in the context of how much that material costs in EPR fees per pound. There's bonuses for reuse and refill, and there's a malus on every pound of virgin plastic that is put into the market. And that malus is intended to fund the bonuses for yourself or for other producers. The malus isn't really tied to any source reduction that you do. It's simply a another fee on plastic that you put into the market. If you reduced your virgin plastic by 25% by either using PCR or reducing your weight in total, like using less plastic packaging, for example. Now your malus would go down by 25%, but it doesn't go away. Like you're still paying it for whatever's remaining. There's a couple key exclusions from this. One is targets for individual producers to reduce weight or components. We covered that on the last slide. Like you don't have a specific target. You have to get to 25% or you have to get to 15%. It's just not in the plan at the moment. There are no direct penalties for not reducing. There's an opportunity to receive bonuses for reduction in activity and a slight penalty in terms of a malus for maybe plastic you didn't reduce. But there's not like a fine for not hitting the 25% target, for example. And one exclusion also is just clarity on the enforceability of these individual source reduction plans and clarity on their privacy to the marketplace. The guidance is not final. Even this guidance document from CAA, CalRecycle still has to approve the plan, and that's going to happen after the plans are submitted. So there could be changes to the plan. We don't know like what that's going to look like. It'll depend on what the producers come back with to CAA on whether or not it's looking like CAA is going to be able to hit these targets collectively. So where do you start? Like what do you do now? You have to submit this plan. You need to reduce. Like how do you think about this? How do you get going on it? This is a strategy framework that we use with clients. There's multiple steps to it. The first one is aligning data. Your baseline, what are you working from? You probably have some of this already from the data that you've submitted for your weight reporting, but there's some other stuff you might want to layer in there, like how can you change it? What part of your business is it in? Is it contractually obligated? Things like that. Setting targets, trying to figure out like how far you want to reduce, what types of things you want to do, and translating those into KPIs that you can track over time. You want to develop your strategy. So are you going to rely on PCR? Are you going to shift your plastic film into a paper category? Are you going to switch from disposable tertiary packaging to a reuse kind of backhaul model? These are all questions that individual producers need to think about. And then also build the business cases for those because those changes aren't free, neither are the EPR fees. But you want to understand like what's the order of magnitude on the puts and takes of each of these opportunities. And then you need to be able to operationalize and communicate this because if you're going to make reductions, it's going to be a cross-functional exercise. Your supply chain is going to be involved. Your suppliers are going to be involved. Your marketing team is probably going to be involved, especially if you're using like a format shift for your primary customer-facing products would be an example. And then you want to be able to track that and share that over time. Probably want to have a program lead, somebody who's individually responsible for this. So that's an overarching framework, but how to think about this in your organization. There's 5 pathways you can use for source reduction. These are outlined under the law. The first one is elimination, which is getting rid of plastic and replacing it with nothing. So there's an example I like to use. I bought a tennis racket at Target like last year. And in that box with a tennis racket, there were like 17 plastic components. Ties holding it in there, little brackets, like the box had plastic on it. There's a bunch of stuff in there. In that example, that producer could probably remove 80% of those components and 80% of the plastic weight associated with those and replace it with nothing. That is what elimination looks like. The packaging goes away. The second one is lightweighting. So making that plastic thinner or a different format that weighs less, um, or making it smaller. If you're shrink wrapping a big thing and you kind of over shrink it to like just to be sure, maybe you can like cut that by 10%. Like don't over shrink it quite as much, for example. Um, Increased PCR, which would reduce your virgin content. This is called alternative compliance under the law. And collectively, CAA can get 8 percentage points of the 25 percentage points just by using more APR certified material in the future compared to how much APR certified material there was in 2023. There's a provision in the law where Cal Recycle could appoint other certifications for PCR as well, but so far that hasn't happened. So as of now, it is all APR certified. Um, the next one is shifting to non-plastic packaging. So if you have a plastic format and you change that to a paper-dominated format, that would shift to another category, reduce the amount of plastic. That would be shifting your material. Then finally, reuse and refill. CAA wants to know about this. There's also a bring your own container line in the individual source reduction report that is more tailored towards food service type operations. But these are the main pathways that you can think about. Our view here is quick wins over the longer term, elimination, lightweighting, PCR, much faster, much easier generally. But then shifting your format to something that has a similar function but isn't plastic takes a little longer. And then reuse and refill also takes longer as well because you don't control all of that. That also involves consumer preferences and impacts your sales if you don't do it right. So these are the main categories to think about. Now we're getting into how PCX, how do we think about this? How are we helping clients think about their source reduction opportunities? We tend to list them all out, every idea that the company might have, and we'll plot them out looking at, how complex they are. Like a proxy for this would be how long would it take to get done? But there's also technical implications. If you have a protective plastic packaging, there's barrier properties, there's strength requirements, there's things like that that go into complexity. And then along the bottom, you see cost. Obviously, if it's cheaper, it's maybe more of a quick win. If it's super expensive but high impact, maybe that is a one that you maybe pilot now but actually do fully later. Um, and then looking at the size of the impact, you got to be able to see all the options and how they compare to each other before you can make any informed decisions because there are second order effects beyond just hitting your own internal or your own CAA targets. Some of these changes can affect your supply chain and marketing and all these other things as well. So you want to look at the whole picture when you think about your alternatives that are applicable to your situation. Something we do with our tools is we help do scenario modeling on this. This is some illustrative scenario modeling here on the page, but if you look at, what if you don't change your plan? Maybe your source reduction is negative. Maybe you're not going to get there. So what do your fees look like in that case? And then what is the malice? There's that plastic malice. There's guidance on how big it might get in the CAA document. You can think about that year by year. How does it work? And what if you do some small things? Maybe you want to lean on PCR because you don't really need to change anything in that case. You just need to incorporate PCR into your packages. Sometimes it's more expensive, sometimes it's at parity, and you can think about what might that cost for you to reduce your fees a little bit and gain some source reduction targets. There is some risk in that strategy. If the whole market goes for PCR, there could be both cost crunch in terms of material, but then also what if CAA goes to Cal Recycle and they're getting all the source reduction from PCR over the limit? Like, what's Cal Recycle going to say? So there's other considerations as well. And then finally, in a third scenario, like, what does it take to hit the target? What initiative costs? What investments need to be made? What bonuses might you get through the incentive program? If you're shifting categories, you might get savings on EPR fees because a paper category, all things equal, is going to be a tenth, half to a tenth of the cost of a plastic category. These are all things that you need to think about to have an informed source reduction plan that works with your um, um, CEO, works with your CFO, works with your supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. This is the type of thinking that we're helping companies put behind it. In terms of a program plan, this is how you might think about organizing, not just for this plan submission, but over the long term. Like how do you think about this? You need to get your data operations right. You'd be a RACI in there, like who's responsible, who's accountable, like are you going to have meetings to track progress? You've got your packaging strategy. This would inform your individual source reduction plan. But which of these things, you plotted it out, you looked at scenarios, which ones are you going to pursue? Which ones are the quick wins you're going to do first? What are the long-term ones that you might start with a pilot and then scale up depending on how things go? And then, of course, making reductions, actually getting these done. You need ongoing engagement with the supply chain. Any large organization I've ever worked with in any context doesn't have all the visibility of like what's happening in the plant all the time. So you need ways to track and verify and ensure that these things are actually happening. Cross-functional program management, super important to making this work. These are some examples of some quicker win, kind of off the shelf reduction opportunities that we're seeing people use to get out of plastic, at least to some extent. The first one is primary packaging. There's a bunch of options out there. There's a lot of benchmarks for just swapping to a paper first package. Sometimes there's barrier properties that are harder to address, but many things can be moved to an alternative package. You might want to move non-functional plastic components. This box, for example, has a big plastic window in it. Maybe that's not needed. Maybe it can be a non-plastic type of film that goes on there. And then there's off-the-shelf swaps for lighter, more efficient packages that just use less plastic in general. Not everybody's optimized that for that, whether it's a cost decision or a shelf presence decision. But there's many options that are out there today. And the next one is your secondary packaging, eliminating plastic overwraps. That is something that lots of people are thinking about doing. It eliminates components, it eliminates cost because you're no longer using that plastic, and it's going to eliminate your EPR fees and get you closer to the targets. Many different ways there. They're a little less impactful on the customer experience. Then finally, your tertiary packaging. If you're doing e-commerce, switching away from plastic tapes and glues in your boxes, switching away from plastic pillows, things like that. And then looking at non-plastic alternatives for the same functions that you're already achieving. And then everybody uses pallets, using reusable pallets in terms of how you wrap those using thinner gauge or higher PCR wrap. These are things that are available today. There's many different suppliers providing this right now. This is something that we do and can help with, also with the business case as well, because sometimes these swaps aren't free. Sometimes there's a cost implication. And sometimes there's a machinery implication. Like, do you need new equipment? Does your current equipment need to be adjusted? If you're working with a lot of these like e-commerce and tertiary packaging suppliers, if you switch to a different supplier with a long-term contract, some of them will come in and adjust your equipment and do some light maintenance on it for free as part of that contract. These are all things you need to be discussing with your supply chain and the folks who are supplying this packaging within your organization. So how do you baseline for source reduction? Like, how do you like, what are you calculating from? You have your weight target, or your weight that you've submitted, but is that enough to think about like where you would strategize to lower that weight? Because there's data behind that weight as well. So I'm going to give an example of how we think about this, and I think you might see a lot of parallels in how you might want to think about this as well. The first one is using a tool that's better than a spreadsheet to be able to look at what is your packaging, what is your weight, how do you scale this, how do you give everybody access, how do you allocate these fees that you're going to be incurring, whether these are source reduction, malice and bonus fees, or your just general EPR fees as well. How do you allocate those across business units? And then something we provide as part of our service is policy intelligence as well. Some of these things I was saying earlier, like what's the like how private, how for sure are some of these individual source reduction plans. We also offer our team of analysts to help with this, and then of course the platform. You want to do everything you can to lower your complexity when you're trying to make decisions about your packaging that will have second order effects. You really need to have a good data platform to be able to understand how to do this. These are some like applied examples coming out of ours. There's lots of options out there. I think ours is pretty great though. Um, and here you can see your component and weight opportunity. You can see what's recyclable or non-recyclable. In addition to source reduction, CAA has to have 100% of that package being recyclable in the future. That's something you probably want to think about when you're deciding to make shifts for source reduction. What are your highest opportunity SKUs, and how does that affect the customer, and how does that affect the packaging you're using for it? And then the financial part of this is super, super important because it's not just about EPR fees. You want to be able to see, what is your opportunity to reduce these EPR fees and where they go right now. But also, you need to be thinking about what does it mean for your supply chain and your procurement costs as well. We can help with all of this. If there's something you're interested, send us an email. Happy to get more time with you. Um, and with that, we're going to move on to Q&A. I saw there were a bunch of questions coming in,
Yep.
and it looks like we have almost 20 minutes to start taking
Start
some.
addressing them. Yeah. Thank you, Russell. That was a quick fly through, so I'm sure there was a lot to digest there. And actually, there was one of the questions which I want to make sure everybody's aware of as to whether these materials will be shared. And yes, for those who have registered as participants, we'll send out a link to the material so you can reference that going forward. So let me get into a couple of the general and more specific questions. Let me start with one of the general ones, which there's a question here, Russell, about the misconceptions about what, quote, counts as source reduction versus not. If you can get into just, I know you addressed this a little bit, but if you can address that question, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. Um, so at the end of the day, when you go to report your um, annual source reduction report, kind of beyond your individual source reduction plan, you'll be reporting on the total amount of plastic that you put into the market. That is the ultimate number that's going to matter the most. Um, Under that, you will list all the reduction activities that you did, how much lightweighting, how much substitution, how much elimination you might have done. But those amounts end up getting allocated in a formula that CAA provides in the template. That, if you did all this reduction, but your sales went up by so much that you actually put more plastic into the market than you did in the year before, those will end up as zero. So really, it's the most important thing is just the total amount of plastic. You can get alternative credit by using PCR that doesn't reduce your amount of plastic at all, but it is alternative credit that counts at the PRO level, and you get bonuses for that. So I really think about that total plastic number and where you can't get there. Also be thinking about PCR.
Great. Let me go to some more specifics, and I'll read this one directly. We're a kitchen restaurant distributor. How does this all apply to us if we don't make anything, but we do ship to some of these states, Oregon, Colorado, et cetera? Would the burden of liability fall on the vendors who sell their products to us or who ship the items to these states? This is not specifically about source reduction, but more about EPR, producer definition. But
Yeah. Um, so I did include it in here. We've covered that in some of our prior webinars, but typically the producer is the brand owner, the person who's selling it into the state. And if it's not them, it would fall to their licensee or then to the distributor, the person who's bringing it into the state. Um, and to this person who asked this question, I would suggest working with the producer or the brand owner who owns this material that you're selling, because what CAA is going to be tracking is the brands, the named things that are sold within California, and that brand will end up on a non-compliance list. And then you'll have to have a discussion with the person who's you're buying this from, who you're distributing it for, um, who is liable to that, because someone will have to pay the fees, someone will have to do the backdated reporting, there are penalties involved. You should really have a conversation with your brand partner like sooner than later to figure that out. And then it is tricky sometimes who is if the distributor becomes the producer or not. Because like for an example, in a multi-brand store, like a grocery store, that grocery store is going to have private label products that it's like Kroger brand baked beans or whatever. But they're also going to have Bush's baked beans. For the branded stuff, Bush's would be the producer because they're sending their branded stuff in there. But for Kroger in this illustrative example, the Kroger private label stuff, Kroger is choosing what product that is. They are choosing the packaging. They are marketing and selling it into the state. They would be responsible for that portion of the product that they're selling through their stores.
So it's very situation specific to ultimately
Mm.
answer your question. If you want to contact us offline, we're happy to talk more deeply about that and get into it in more specificity. All right, let me go to the next one. In their guidance, CAA clarified that for the incremental target years 27 and 30, the minimum amount of reduction that must come from RRE cannot include elimination. 2% of the 10% total by 27, 4% of 20 by 2030. For those incremental targets, elimination can only be claimed under the other pathways from the legislation. So
Mhm.
this means all producers must use reuse refill for 27 and 30. Seems very challenging. Is this your understanding as well?
Yeah, this is very
The short
challenging.
answer is yes.
Yeah, this is very challenging. No question about that. Um, Well, when you do your source reduction plan, your annual source reduction, there is a category where you type in how much is elimination. Um, I understood that you could do elimination for any of these targets as well. And possibly it only counts to the overall 25% reduction target, or can only be added in with reuse in a refill in that final year, 2031. But I also encourage you to look at the guidance document and see like there are no specific targets on any individual producers to hit any of these individual numbers in the incentive plan from CAA. So it's something that you need to consider when you think about drafting your individual source reduction plan and what parts of it you're able to comply with.
Great. Okay, here's another one. What happens if companies fail to meet the mandated source reduction targets in terms of regulatory consequence, business risk, et cetera?
Um, it's unclear right now. In the legislation, the target's on the PRO. The target's not on the companies. And so far, CAA has elected not to pass through those targets to the individual companies, but rather use a financial incentive model for companies to hopefully voluntarily, under those financial incentives, get to the source reduction numbers. Um, we don't know what Cal Recycle is going to do. Cal Recycle sets the rules, and CAA is the implementer of those rules. And CalRecycle could come back and give individual targets to companies. They could impose additional penalties as well in the legislation. Non-compliance, broadly defined, can be up to $50,000 a day. Really, this is one of those gray areas that CAA hasn't defined yet. Of like, what happens if you specifically don't reduce 25%? So far, there is not a super clear penalty for not doing that. beyond having higher exposure to EPR fees and higher exposure to the malice.
Great. Next one. This is organizationally oriented here. So, which internal teams or functions typically need to be involved for source reduction to succeed, and where do breakdowns most often occur?
Yeah. Um, you're typically going to have somebody who's your EPR person, that's already been thinking about your EPR reporting. That person's definitely going to be on the team, but you're absolutely going to need whoever does your R&D or packaging specifications and your procurement team. Those are absolutely key. And then also, with both of those, your CFO or your director of finance, whoever has the correct oversight for this level of cost in your company. Those people absolutely have to be involved just to figure out in the beginning, just like what's possible, what's available in the marketplace, how soon can we even do it regardless of the cost. But then second order effects where things can start to break down is if you're making I don't know, cookies in plastic bags and you're selling those into grocery stores. If you switch those to boxes because it doesn't have plastic anymore, what are consumers going to think about that? How's that going to affect your sales? What is the branding and marketing team going to say? Because if you go and make commitments to CAA, but they haven't had a say in like what's going to happen to your product, like actually this reduction that in theory is possible is going to be actually a lot harder for us to implement. We'd rather pay the fees. That is a place where you would possibly have some breakdown. Um, and then another place is also your suppliers. You probably want to be engaging them from the start. Like if you're banking on being able to move from 0% PCR to 50% PCR on your shrink wrap, for example, can your supplier supply that? Do you need a new supplier? Do you need multiple bids? Those are kind of second order things or places where it can start to break down. But hopefully that was helpful and like who might be the most useful to start thinking about it.
Great. Okay, specific one here again. How would a food manufacturer be able to utilize refill, reuse, source reduction pathway if the products we're putting on the market are products sold to grocery stores and retailers?
There's a few different reuse and refill applications in the various guidances that CAA has provided. Um, you can have refill at home, kind of like a bulk thing, and then like a smaller container. That's one, for example, that doesn't have a take back program. If you're going into a retailer where they used to have bins of bulk items. That's another pathway. I'd really recommend checking out the specific guidance and examples that CAA has provided on this because I think everybody knows that's a really hard thing with consumer convenience and food safety requirements.
Right. Uh, are all pathways required to be utilized as part of source reduction?
No, they're not. You can use any combination of pathways you like. There's the maximum at the PRO level of 8% of PCR out of the 25%, but CAA hasn't provided any maximum for what you can individually use. So you can choose to use PCR, you can choose not to use PCR. There is the requirement also at the PRO level of reuse and refill of 10% source reduction. But beyond that, an individual company can lightweight their way to source reduction. They can eliminate their way to source reduction. They can shift from plastic to paper out of source or plastic to glass out of source reduction. So it's really up to you.
Good. I hit this one lightly at the front, but it's worth reiterating this question here, or the answer to this question. Beyond California, what other global legislation or regulatory frameworks include explicit source reduction requirements? Can the same reduction tactics work in multiple jurisdictions?
Um, is definitely a two-part question. The first one is there isn't much. California is pretty new, pretty innovative, pretty aggressive. I think the world's going to be watching to see how it goes. Um, In other jurisdictions where they've tried to reduce the amount of plastic with like fee-based models, for example, more EPR fees on plastic haven't necessarily reduced the amount of plastic. I think that's widely known and understood. Um, and the second part of that question is actions you take, initiatives you undergo, can they be applicable in other jurisdictions? Absolutely, they can. Because typically most plastic containing products are less recyclable than paper dominant products in general. There's some exception like PET, HDPE jugs, widely collected, widely recycled, but like films, like that's tough everywhere. If you're making source reduction choices to use less plastic in these products, or you're going to use more recycled content in these products, there is legislation all over the place focused on recyclability and lower fees for more recyclable materials. There will be benefits in other locations as well. And then there's still a big question mark about all the other US states. And there's like 10, I think, that have source reduction, or not source reduction, EPR laws on the books, waiting to be finalized and signed into law. Some of those are more aggressive, that are probably going to look more like New York with some source reduction. And some of those are not going to be as aggressive. That'll basically be a report and pay on your packaging weights. So anything you're doing for source reduction will have benefits in other places, but you need to be thinking about your strategy. How do you go after that? Which order? If you're switching out of plastic and switching into like a monoplastic or different types of paper, like which one is going to be most beneficial across all of these different rules?
Okay. This next one's a good segue from you speaking to examples here. So, can you share an example of a packaging or product change that delivered meaningful source reduction without negatively impacting performance or customer experience?
Um, Yeah, the biggest ones are probably going to be in your tertiary packaging if you're thinking about that customer experience. Pallets, wrap, cases, plastic on cases, things the customer doesn't really see or the customer buys, opens, and throws away like the big package. It's not the actual thing they're drinking out of, the thing that they're scooping their laundry detergent out of. Um, those tend to be the least consumer impacting. And there's a bunch of things you can do there to either eliminate plastic or use PCR to lightweight. Actually quite a number of kind of market scaled opportunities you can start looking at already. Would certainly help with that. But in terms of some of the biggest shifts for companies where their primary packaging is involved, that's where your biggest source reduction opportunity is going to be because that's where most of your plastic material probably lives today. Those are going to be more impactful to customers just by definition. They're going to see them, they're going to feel them, they're going to look at them on the shelf when they decide what product to buy. And there's a lot of good work happening globally. Pretty much anything you can think of, someone has piloted in market somewhere. Something that we're helping companies with when we think about source reduction strategies. If you're going to change one of these major packages, like who's already done it and how did it go, and is there enough scale for what we need? There are a lot of options out there. So yeah, I think I answered that one, Sebastian.
Yep. I have one more here, and then we'll see. We're getting close to time. What kinds of data and documentation do regulators in California expect to see to demonstrate that the reduction has actually occurred?
Um, it is all going to be the same as what you've already submitted in May. You're self-attesting on APR certification. You're self-attesting that these weights and measures are correct. And I think CAA is giving you the benefit of the doubt in this case. However, CAA has extensive rights to audit any producer they think is um, doing something wrong one way or another. And when that happens, they might start asking for, well, what went into this? Show us the data behind it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's additional documentation. I think the best way to mitigate this particular risk is to be super detailed um, in your methodology statements of how you're calculating what's been changing, things like that.
Great. I think we're close to time, and I think we've hit all of the questions here. Any last thoughts from you, Russell? I have one closing comment, but um, if you want to add anything else, or
Um, it just like this is a tough problem. The ask from the law that CAA is doing their best to accommodate is not easy for anybody. So, thank you for doing your best. Generally, the state of California as a whole, the producer community as a whole, it's a tough thing. And if you need help, if you want somebody to talk to, send us an email. We're happy to, just get on the call for a little bit and see what your situation is.
yeah, I just want to say one more thing here, which is that piling on to this being a challenge, it's not just a challenge from a regulatory perspective, right? The work we're doing with several of our partners in developing these source reduction strategies is as much or more focused on the internal dynamics of how the decisions need to be made to balance regulatory compliance with good business decisions and your relationship with your customers and the health of your brand. And that's where this gets really tricky and really challenging. And so there's a change management component to this inside the organization that matters as much or more as what do we need to do to meet the compliance requirements from CAA and Cal Recycle. And we have a lot of experience working and helping companies navigate that internally and providing the fact base and the analytics to support a really robust internal discussion to weigh all of those considerations appropriately. And so I would just, encourage you to reach out to us. We're happy to, with no commitment on your part to have to sign us up for anything, we're happy to help provide some of our experience on that and hear you out on some of the challenges you may be facing in navigating that yourselves. So thanks for joining. On to the next challenge here for everyone. Feel free to reach out to us. Again, we will distribute the materials and provide links to the recording as well for those who weren't able to join. And we'll look forward to seeing you in our next webinar.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all and have a great
Bye.
day.